So Archimedes said, give me a lever long enough and I can move the world. Now the good news is pension schemes don't need to move the world. Unfortunately, what they need to do is almost as difficult, which is try and get better funded without taking too much risk. Why can't they take a lot of risk? Because then they risk being blown so far off course they can't get back. So how do you do this? Really, you've got two objectives. One is a risk objective, one is a return objective. How do you meet the risk objective? You've got to reduce the volatility of the funding ratio. How do you do that? You need to look at both having low volatile assets, but also a lot of the risk coming from liabilities. How do you hedge liabilities? You match them. How are your liabilities calculated? With gilts. So a simple portfolio to match liabilities by a large portfolio of gilts. However, you also need to get return. How do you get the return? You need to get return by investing in assets that give you a higher return than your discount rate. Now, your discount rate is gilts, so you have to buy investments to give you a higher return from gilts. So you really have to square the circle of needing returns that are higher than gilts, but also needing to invest in gilts. How do you square that circle? Leverage. Now, what you might say, I don't want to take leverage. What do I do in that circumstance? Well, that really leaves you with two choices. You can either say, I'm happy to let my liability remain unhedged, I just invest in high return assets, then I've got a lot of risk. Alternatively, I can put all my money in gilts, I can hedge my liabilities very well, but I'm not going to get very much return. So that means to get to full funding, I'm going to be completely dependent on my sponsor. I won't get much in the way of investment return. Now, what could I do as an alternative? First thing I could do, I can leverage equities. There's a large liquid futures market, relatively cheap to lever, gives you a very similar performance to passive equities. What's the downside with that? One, from a risk perspective, your equity allocation probably isn't big enough to get you the amount of gilts you need to hedge your liabilities. From a return perspective, you're putting all your returns from equities. And we've seen over the last few days, equities don't always go up. Not that they're not a good source of long-term return, but it's good to have a diverse sources of return. Second idea is indirect leverage. Things like private equity, SME lending, opportunistic property, all where you're getting leverage via the fund manager. The big drawback with these assets is a risk perspective. You probably won't have enough to be able to get the gilts you need to hedge your liabilities. From a return perspective, leverage is relatively expensive. You're paying a lot more for leverage in other cases, and also these are relatively high fee structures. You're paying both high fees and high leverage costs. So what can you do? You can leverage gilts. This basically gives you both the gilt hedge you need against your liabilities, but also allows you to invest in the assets that are going to provide you with return. Now, what things you need to look at when you leverage gilts? Two things are very important: the availability of that leverage and the cost of that leverage. If I look at the availability of gilt repo, if I'm a bank and the gilt repo market becomes tight or just ceases to exist, I can go to the Bank of England, and the Bank of England will provide me leverage against that gilt position. However, if you're a pension scheme, you don't have that option. The banks have no requirement to give you leverage all the time. How do you mitigate that risk? You can never completely remove it, but what you can do is spread your requirements leverage over time. So never have too much of your position rolling off in a single day, a week, or a month. So spread it over a year or more. That still means you might lose some of your hedges if the market does shut, but what it does mean is that even the worst case on that scenario is still, in a way, the best case when you don't use any leverage at all, because you've lost your hedge, but you've had the benefits of the hedge until you lose it. The other point with gilt repo is the cost. Now, I'm allowed one formula in my presentation, and this is it. So what does this formula mean? Very quickly, under Basel III regulations, big change, banks have to hold capital against repo positions. And banks, being that they're not generally charitable institutions, though a lot of them have given a lot of money away in recent years, they need to earn a return on their capital. So that means on a repo position, 4% capital, 15% return on capital, 60 basis points per annum cost. This is one of the reasons why repo cost has increased a lot over the last few years. But the good news is this is already in a lot of the pricing, particularly in gilt swap pricing. A lot of this has been factored in already. So what is the overall conclusion we can draw from this? It's likely you'll need leverage to achieve your goals. If you want to achieve both the risk and return goals, you're probably going to need some degree of leverage. You need to manage it carefully and spread your exposure. You need to consider it in the same risk framework. And you need to be aware both of the costs and of the benefits, because sometimes not having leverage is actually a lot more risky than having leverage.